Okay, so you ready to dive in?
Always ready for a deep dive, especially into a passage like Isaiah 6, 1-8.
And I know you're thinking, ugh, not Isaiah again. Haven't we heard it all before? But trust me,
Yeah,
this one's a little different. We're going beyond the usual Sunday school stuff here.
absolutely.
This is for those of you who are preaching and teaching this passage week in and week out. You know, the pastors, the Bible study leaders, the folks who are looking for those fresh insights.
Right, because let's face it, we can all get stuck in a rut sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So we've been digging through a whole stack of sermons on Isaiah 6, 1-8.
Mhm.
Sermons from different churches and denominations.
Yeah, and what's been really striking is just how many different ways there are to approach this passage.
Right. It's like every pastor has their own unique angle,
Uh-huh.
their own spin on Isaiah's vision.
And it really speaks to the richness and depth of this text.
Exactly. And that's what we're after today. Those non-obvious insights, those sermon illustrations that really stick with people.
Mhm.
Maybe even spark a fresh idea for your next sermon or study session.
Now, one theme that popped up again and again in these sermons was the transformative power of encountering God's holiness.
Okay, that's a big one. I mean, holiness is kind of a foundational concept in Christianity.
Absolutely. It's at the very core of who God is.
But I'm guessing these pastors went beyond just the usual God is holy, we are not kind of thing.
Oh, for sure. They really dug into the nuances of holiness and how it impacts our lives. Like, RCCTV had this interesting take on the repetition of holy, holy, holy in the King James Version.
Yeah, why holy, holy? Why say it 3 times?
Their point is that that threefold repetition is meant to emphasize the utter completeness of God's holiness.
So it's like they're trying to drive home the point, really make us stop and think about it.
Exactly. It's not just about understanding holiness intellectually. It's about helping the congregation feel it viscerally, experience that sense of awe and wonder.
I see. So it's less about a theological definition and more about creating an emotional experience.
Right. They're trying to evoke a sense of being totally overwhelmed by God's presence.
Okay, but then we have Boulder Mountain Church, and they're coming at it from a completely different angle.
Yeah, they're focused less on the fear and trembling aspect and more on how encountering God's holiness should lead to a deeper relationship with Him.
So it's not just about recognizing God's power, but also his love and grace.
Exactly. They see Isaiah's vision as a pivotal moment where he transitions from empty religious ritual to a genuine connection with the divine.
So how do they illustrate that transition?
Well, they use the analogy of the burning coal purifying Isaiah's lips to represent God's forgiveness, cleansing us and enabling us to respond to his call with a willing heart.
Interesting. So it's not just about being cleansed from sin, but also being empowered to live a life of purpose.
Right. It's about recognizing our unworthiness, but also embracing the amazing grace that makes us worthy.
Okay, so we've got 2 very different approaches to the same concept.
Mhm.
Now, for our listeners, the pastors and teachers, prepping their next message, what stands out to you in these contrasting approaches?
That's a great question. I think what it highlights is the need to consider our specific audience, right?
Right.
What might resonate with one group might not land the same way with another.
So RCCTB's approach, with the emphasis on awe and wonder, might work well for a congregation that's more intellectually driven,
Yeah.
while Boulder Mountain Church's focus on relationship could connect more with those who are craving emotional connection.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about knowing your audience and crafting your message in a way that will resonate with them on a deeper level.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, we want people to not just understand the concept of holiness, but to be transformed by it.
Absolutely. And the beauty of Isaiah 6, 1-8 is that it holds space for both of those aspects, that awe-inspiring power and that intimate love of God.
And that's what makes it such a rich and powerful passage to preach and teach on.
For sure. It's a passage that can continue to speak to us in new ways, no matter how many times we've encountered it before.
Now, it's interesting that neither of those churches focus solely on the call narrative aspect of the passage. You know, that here am I, send me moment that we usually hear about.
Yeah, a lot of these pastors moved beyond the surface level of the call narrative and dug into other aspects of the passage, like the cause church, for instance. They focused on the transformative power of obedience, even when that obedience doesn't make sense on a human level.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Well, they drew a really thought-provoking parallel between Isaiah saying, "Here am I, send me," and the story of Ananias in Acts 9.
Ananias, remind me.
Ananias was the disciple who was instructed by God to go and minister to Saul, the guy who had been persecuting Christians.
Oh, right. Talk about a scary assignment.
Yeah, but Ananias obeyed, even though it made no logical sense, and it led to Saul's conversion and transformation into the Apostle Paul.
Wow, so they're basically saying that Isaiah's yes was an act of radical obedience.
Yeah.
He had no idea what he was signing up for.
Exactly, and they use this parallel to inspire action in their own congregation. It's like they're saying, look, even when it's terrifying, even when you don't understand the why, obedience to God's call leads to incredible things.
Okay, that's powerful.
Yeah.
But then we have Destiny Church, and they went for a totally different vibe. They're all about being, what did they say, fired up for God?
Fired up is a good way to put it. They use that imagery of the seraphim, literally burning with passion, to encourage that same kind of enthusiastic, energetic faith in their congregation.
They actually compared it to sports chants, which might seem a little unorthodox for a sermon illustration.
It might sound unconventional, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
How so?
Well, sports chants are all about rallying people together, creating a sense of shared energy and purpose.
Right, getting everyone on the same page,
Yeah.
fired up for the game.
Exactly. And Destiny Church is trying to tap into that same energy and apply it to faith. Instead of chanting for your team, you're chanting for God.
I could see how that could really resonate with a certain audience.
Especially a younger audience. It's all about knowing your congregation and finding those illustrations that will connect with them on a deeper level.
So for our listeners out there, pastors working on your next sermon, what are those illustrations that will resonate with your people? What are their interests?
Yeah, what are their cultural references? What will really spark that aha moment for them? Don't be afraid to think outside the box.
Sometimes the most unexpected illustrations are the ones that really hit home.
Exactly.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How we keep coming back to this idea of holiness.
Yeah, it's clearly more than just some abstract theological concept for these pastors.
It seems like they're wrestling with it, trying to grasp its depth and its power.
Yeah, like they're trying to figure out how to communicate this profound truth in a way that will really connect with people.
And they're coming at it from all these different angles.
Like the pastors from Parkview Christian Church, Worcester, they really emphasize that fear of the Lord, that sense of trembling before a power so much greater than ourselves.
Right. Who am I to stand before the Holy One? Kind of feeling that Isaiah himself expresses.
Exactly. They really highlighted that sense of awe and wonder that comes with recognizing our smallness in the face of the divine.
Okay, so that's one side of it, that awe and reverence.
But then you have pastors, like biblically speaking, who focus more on the transformative power of beholding God's glory.
So it's not just about being afraid of God's power, but also being captivated by his beauty.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that God's holiness is not just something to be feared, it's something to be desired, something to be pursued.
And it's reflected in the way Isaiah responds to God's call, right? He doesn't run away in terror. He says, "Here I am, send me."
Exactly. There's awe and reverence, of course, but also a deep desire to be part of God's plan.
So the question for our listeners, especially those who are preparing to preach or teach on this passage, becomes, how do we present this complex, multifaceted concept of holiness in a way that engages and inspires?
Yeah, how do we move beyond the cliches and help people truly experience the transformative power of encountering the Holy One?
Just a tall order for sure.
One thing that really stood out to me as I was reading these sermons was the power of storytelling.
Oh, absolutely. Stories have a way of grabbing our attention and making us care.
Yeah, they make those abstract concepts more concrete, more relatable.
Give us an example. What were some of the illustrations that really grabbed your attention?
Well, we talked earlier about Ada Bible's analogy of meeting a famous person, how that feeling of awe and wonder can mirror Isaiah's experience in God's presence.
Right.
But Holywell Church Loughborough used a different approach. They talked about the feeling of being inappropriately dressed at a formal event.
Oh, I can relate to that. That feeling of being out of place, of not belonging. It's almost a visceral experience.
Exactly. And they use that feeling to illustrate how Isaiah must have felt in the presence of God's holiness.
Like you suddenly become aware of your own flaws, your own imperfections.
Right. And it's that realization that leads to transformation.
So how do we apply that to the spiritual realm?
Well, in the same way that we'd rush to the bathroom to fix our appearance if we were inappropriately dressed, we should be eager to confess our sins and seek God's forgiveness when we come face to face with his holiness.
It's about recognizing our need for cleansing, for purification.
And that's where the image of the burning coal touching Isaiah's lips comes in.
Right, it's a symbol of God's grace, his ability to purify us and make us whole.
It's a beautiful picture of how God's holiness doesn't just expose our flaws, it also offers us the solution.
Okay, that's a good one.
Another powerful illustration came from Mount Olivet Baptist Church.
What do they use?
They use the Hebrew word kabod to describe God's glory.
Kabad. Now, there's a word you don't hear every day.
It's a fascinating word. It means glory, of course, but it also carries this connotation of weightiness, of substance.
So it's not just a fleeting feeling or a vague concept. It's something real, something substantial.
That's exactly the point they were making. God's glory is something tangible, something that has a real impact on our lives.
Okay, I like that.
And they said that when we truly encounter God's kabod, when we experience the weight and reality of His glory, it reveals our own shortcomings.
So it's like holding up a mirror to our souls.
Yes. But not to shame us, but to prepare us for our best life.
To show us the areas where we need to grow.
Right. It's not about beating ourselves up for our flaws. It's about recognizing them and allowing God to work in us.
It's about letting go of the things that are holding us back and embracing the fullness of who God created us to be.
And that process of transformation, though it can be painful at times, is ultimately a beautiful and liberating experience.
Now, as we're talking about these illustrations, I'm noticing that they all seem to be geared towards individual transformation.
Yeah, that's true.
But what about the impact on the community? Does encountering God's holiness have implications beyond our own personal lives?
That's a great question, and one that several of these pastors addressed.
Oh,
They
right.
talked about how individual transformation is not an end in itself. It's meant to overflow into the community.
So it's not just about having a private religious experience. It's about becoming agents of change in the world.
Exactly. And we see this pattern throughout the Bible. When God transforms individuals like Abraham, Moses, and David, their transformed lives have a ripple effect on the people around them.
Right. They become catalysts for change, bringing God's blessing and purpose to their communities.
So how do we, as pastors and teachers, apply that to our own ministries? How do we foster that kind of communal transformation?
The big question.
It starts with recognizing that we're not in this alone. We need each other.
We need to support and encourage each other, hold each other accountable.
Exactly. We need the support, encouragement, and accountability of a community to help us grow and mature in our faith.
So it's about more than just preaching sermons. It's about creating a culture where people can be transformed together.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be vulnerable, to share their struggles and their victories.
To learn from each other, inspire each other, challenge each other to become more like Christ.
And that brings us back to those sermon illustrations we were talking about.
Because they're not just about conveying information, right?
Right. They're about creating a shared experience, helping people connect with the truth on an emotional level.
So let's dig into a few more of these illustrations.
Okay, which one's caught your eye?
Well, the College Church had a really powerful one.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
They used the story of Edward Kimball, a farmer who was deeply moved by a revival meeting and dedicated his life to Christ.
Okay.
And then he shared his faith with a young man named Mordecai Ham, who went on to become an evangelist and preached to millions of people.
Including a young Billy Graham, I believe.
Exactly. So one man's simple act of obedience had this incredible ripple effect that led to the conversion of countless others.
It's amazing how God works, isn't it?
It really is. It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in God's plan.
We might not all be Billy Graham, but we can all be Edward Kimball.
Right, planting those seeds of faith that will grow in ways we can't even imagine.
Now, on a totally different note, we have Destiny Church.
Oh yeah, they're the ones with the sports chants, right?
That's right. Their approach was definitely a bit more, shall we say, energetic.
They were comparing being fired up for God to the excitement of a high school pep rally.
And you know what? It worked. It really resonated with their congregation.
Because it's relatable, right? I mean, who doesn't love a good pep rally?
It's all about creating that sense of unity, of shared passion and purpose.
It's about getting people excited and motivated.
And Destiny Church challenged their congregation to bring that same level of enthusiasm to their faith, to be as passionate about God as they are about their favorite sports team.
It's a little unconventional, but hey, if it gets people fired up for God, why not?
Right. It's all about finding what works for your audience.
But remember, not every illustration has to be loud and energetic.
Some of the most effective ones are the quiet, introspective ones.
Like the one from Parkview Christian Church, Worcester.
Oh, yeah, the Facebook post.
The one written in all caps.
They were talking about the seraphim's repetition of holy, holy, holy in Isaiah's vision.
Yeah.
And they said, it's like someone trying to get your attention on Facebook by writing their entire post in all cap PS.
Oh, I get it. It's like God is shouting at us, pay attention. This is important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
God's holiness demands our attention. It's not something we can just ignore or brush aside.
And it should be a transformative experience, something that shakes us out of our complacency and reorients our priorities.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm really loving these illustrations. They're making me rethink how I approach this passage.
Me too. It's so inspiring to see how creative these pastors are getting.
What other gems did you uncover in these sermons?
Well, Holywell Church Loughborough had one that really resonated with me.
Okay, let's hear it.
They told the story of a man who received a gospel tract in New York and later started a church in Turkey.
Wow, so a small act of kindness had this ripple effect that spanned continents.
It's incredible, isn't it? They use this story to illustrate the importance of being available to God, of being willing to say yes to his call, even when we don't know where it will lead.
Because you never know what impact even a small act of obedience can have.
Right. They emphasize that God's work is volunteer work. Meaning it's not about waiting for the perfect opportunity or the ideal set of circumstances. It's about being available, being willing to step out in faith and trust that God will equip us for the task at hand.
They also had that great line about Corrie ten Boom.
Oh, yeah, that was powerful.
She risked her life to hide Jews during World War II.
Talk about an example of courageous service.
She saw a need, she felt God's prompting, and she responded, even though it put her own life in danger.
And it's a reminder that we don't have to be superheroes or have a seminary degree to make a difference in the world.
God can use ordinary people to do extraordinary things.
And it all goes back to that encounter with God's holiness.
That moment when we realize who God is and who we are in light of his glory.
It changes us, it transforms us, and it equips us to do things we never thought possible.
So for our listeners out there, all those pastors and Bible study leaders who are always looking for fresh ways to engage their congregations, what key takeaway would you offer them from these sermon illustrations?
I would say, don't be afraid to be creative.
Yeah, think outside the box. Look for those real-world examples and cultural references that will resonate with your audience.
Exactly.
Because it's not just about quoting scripture, it's about making it come alive.
It's about helping people understand and experience the truth in a way that is both meaningful and memorable.
And don't underestimate the power of storytelling.
Stories have a way of captivating our hearts and minds in a way that abstract concepts often can't.
Find those stories that illustrate the truth of God's holiness and share them with passion and conviction.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. That idea that encountering God's holiness should lead to a deeper relationship with him.
That's a crucial point, right? It's not just about acquiring knowledge or even being changed. It's about drawing closer to God.
It's about experiencing his love, his grace, and his power in a more profound way.
Boulder Mountain Church really emphasized that transition from religious ritual to a genuine relationship with God.
Yeah, it's not just about going through the motions. It's about experiencing the reality of God's presence in our lives.
So how do we do that? How do we cultivate that kind of deep, intimate relationship with God?
Well, it starts with spending time with him.
Making space in our busy lives for prayer, for Bible study, for meditation.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing our relationship with God, just like we would any other important relationship.
It's about making time for the one who made time for us.
And it's about being open to his leading, listening for his voice in the quiet moments, and seeking his guidance in the midst of our everyday lives.
It's about recognizing that God wants to be involved in every aspect of our lives, not just on Sundays or during our quiet time.
Right, in our work, our relationships, our hobbies, everything.
It's about inviting God into every corner of our lives and allowing him to transform us from the inside out.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Transformation.
Yeah, transformation. That's the ultimate goal.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to explore how this transformative encounter with God's holiness can lead to a life of purpose and mission.
Because it's not just about our own personal growth, right?
Right.
It's about making a difference in the world.
It's about being the hands and feet of Jesus, sharing his love, his grace, and his truth with those around us.
So get ready to be inspired and challenged as we unpack the call to action that flows from Isaiah 6:1-8.
It's a call that resonates across the centuries and speaks to the very heart of our faith.
And it's a call that we are all invited to answer.
So we've spent a good chunk of time unpacking God's holiness, what it means, and how it's been preached.
We've heard it can be awe-inspiring, even a bit scary,
Yeah.
but also something that draws us closer to God.
And we've heard some really creative illustrations bringing this abstract idea to life.
But now, The big question, right?
So what? What do we do with all this?
Exactly, because encountering God's holiness should be more than just an emotional experience.
Or some heady theological debate.
Right, it needs to lead us to action, change how we live.
And that takes us back to Isaiah's response in Isaiah 6, 1-8, that, "Here am I, send me."
A total surrender, saying, use me, God, whatever the cost.
So for our listeners, the pastors and teachers, how do we take that ancient call and make it relevant today?
A lot of the sermons focused on service.
That classic hands and feet of Jesus idea.
Exactly, connecting Isaiah's send me to a broader call to live out our faith.
And the Church had a really interesting take on this.
Oh, yeah. They were all about the power of obedience.
Even when it doesn't make sense to our human brains.
They use that example of Ananias being sent to Saul, the guy persecuting Christians.
Talk about a risky assignment.
But Ananias obeyed, and boom, Saul becomes Paul, the apostle.
Showing that God's ways are higher than our own.
Sometimes the most impactful service comes from those illogical steps of faith.
Okay, but how do we know what God's calling us to do? It's not always a clear path, right?
That's where the spiritual disciplines come in.
Prayer, Bible study, all that good stuff.
Exactly. It's about tuning our ears to God's voice, being ready to follow.
And sometimes that call comes in the most unexpected ways.
Like Holywell Church Lawborough pointed out, God's work is volunteer work. Meaning we don't wait for the perfect opportunity, we make ourselves available.
Like Corrie ten Boom, hiding Jews during the war, putting her own life on the line.
Incredible courage, and a reminder that we don't need fancy titles to make a difference.
God can use anyone.
Right.
Ready and willing to say yes.
Now, another theme that kept coming up was being set apart, that dual nature of holiness.
Ada Bible talked about that, right?
Yeah, being set apart from sin, but also set apart for God.
So it's not just avoiding the bad stuff. It's actively pursuing God's will. But practically speaking, how do we live this out, not just talk about it?
It's those daily choices we make, how we use our time, money, energy.
Do those things align with God's priorities?
And are we surrounding ourselves with people who will push us towards holiness?
That community aspect is huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
We need support, accountability.
Absolutely, because let's be real, we can't do this alone.
We need that tribe to cheer us on.
And to call us out when we're off track.
Helping us become the best versions of ourselves, the people God created us to be.
And here's a really key point as we wrap up. Living out Isaiah 6, 1-8 isn't about perfection.
Whew, glad to hear that.
It's about progress.
Continually striving to be more Christ-like.
Right, knowing we won't fully get there this side of heaven.
And that's where grace comes in.
Absolutely, knowing when we mess up, God's right there to pick us up.
So if anyone's feeling overwhelmed by the call to holiness, remember,
it's not about earning God's favor, it's about surrendering to His transforming power.
Letting Him work in us, mess-ups and all.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We've explored the power of God's holiness, the challenge of Isaiah's call, and heard some amazing sermon illustrations.
Hopefully our listeners are feeling equipped to preach and teach this passage with fresh insight.
To move beyond just studying it to actually living it out.
Being a people set apart for God's purposes, serving Him with passion and humility.
So what will you do with all this?
How will God's holiness transform you and empower you to make a difference?
Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going.
And thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of God's Word.